Hello there, everybody. Joe LoRusso here, the Director of Aviation Law at Ramos Law in Denver, Colorado. Wanted to chat about a recent wreck that occurred out in California at the Montgomery Gibbs Executive Airport on November 5th. This is going to be the unfortunate crash of a Cirrus 2020 SR20 G6, as in Generation 6, with the tail number of November 700 Yankee Zulu. This airplane crashed at about noon while doing pattern work there at the Montgomery Gibbs Airport. It's important, before we dive into theories and how the investigation is going to move forward, that we address the fact that there was one fatality in the wreck. And of course, our thoughts and prayers and sympathy go out to the family and all those friends and family that knew him, as well as the airport community themselves. That is always a big hit for what is most certainly a tight-knit community at an airport. Surely everybody typically knows everybody at an airport, and pilots tend to hang out together. So our heartfelt sympathy goes out to all those who knew the pilot. In an investigation like this, it's important that we address the timelines that are critical. This airport was controlled, so we have the involvement of air traffic control. Air traffic control will retain tapes, what we call tapes, which are both the tracks as well as any ATC audio communications. For 45 days, if there isn't an accident, and if there is an accident that involves ATC communication, i.e. they were directly speaking to the aircraft and the pilot, in that case they'll hold those records for 90 days. If there hasn't been a request made, a FOIA made, Freedom of Information Act request for those records will disappear at the end of 90 days and they will be unrecoverable. So it's important that those involved in the investigation get a hold of those records early. Now, of course, those records will be reflected in the NTSB's report as well as the FAA's report, but to have that raw data, that prime data that an expert can review, sans the involvement of the NTSB, sans the involvement of the FAA. It's important to get a hold of those records early before they become unavailable. Now, this airplane was equipped, the 2020 Cirrus SR22 G6, again the Generation 6. It's a normally aspirated airplane, which means it's not a turbo. Some might be more familiar with the SR22, the Cirrus SR22 turbo, a more common airplane. The 20 is typically used for training. Now, I know I'm gonna catch some flack there online about saying that, but myself, I used to own a flight school for about 5 years prior to becoming an aviation attorney, and believe it or not, we started training on SR20s. It's a fantastic platform for training. It is a little quicker than the common Cherokee 140 or Cessna 172, but I'm a firm believer, always have been, and I think this is Cirrus's philosophy as well, is as long as you have adequate training and you train on the airplane that you're going to fly on, law of primacy says that you're going to revert to that training in the events of an emergency, right? So let's put that into a real world perspective. Say somebody's driving a Lancer 4P, a very quick experimental airplane. If they did all their training on a Cherokee 140 and they experience an in-flight emergency in the Lancer 4P, law of primacy is going to say that they're going to revert back to their training when they felt most comfortable, when they learned all those emergency procedures. And in that case, they're going to slow the airplane down, whether consciously or subconsciously. They're going to slow the airplane down so that the events happen slower and that it's more similar to what they trained on. And in that case, in the event of a Lancer 4P, that could spell out disaster pretty quickly, as that airplane has a supercritical wing. The moment you slow it down, there's a good chance that it's going to depart. So in this case, I'm not opposed to the SR20 as a training platform, which with November 700 Yankee Zulu, it very much was on this day a training platform. As long as the airman is adequately trained on that airplane, sees emergencies on that airplane, and we'll revert back to that training. So I know there's going to be a lot of flack online about the fact that there was training done in a Cirrus SR-20, but it is something that is not unusual. That airplane is equipped with a G1000 perspective, I believe in NXI. I may be wrong on that, but the autopilot is most certainly a GFC 700. That is what we call a technically advanced airplane, a glass panel. Definitely a complex airplane when it comes to information overload and information availability. Very easy to get stuck in a head-down environment, which is what we call in the instructor world, where instead of, as a student, looking out and seeing this, the whole world around you, they get overwhelmed with information overload and the eyes go right down to the screens. Interesting to see if that's going to play a factor, and potentially it will. The GFC 700 autopilot comes with at least, and there may be a yaw damper on this one, I'm not entirely sure, so I'm sure somebody will correct that in the comments, but it does have roll servo, autopilot servos, roll control, pitch control for electric trims, if not a yaw damper as well. So the autopilot is most certainly a 2-axis autopilot, if not a 3-axis autopilot. Something to keep in mind, and that's going to come up in the discussion of this crash. It appears, based on the information available, that this was a first solo, which is very tragic. In that case, we're dealing with a brand new pilot. The first solo is the first time that pilot is operating without a flight instructor on board in an environment that is not anyway contained. It's not restricted. When you solo, by all intents and purposes, you're no different than a normal pilot who just goes out and does pattern work. The first solo is traditionally done at the airport. In this case, it appears that the first solo based on tracks was done with a full stop and taxi back instructions, meaning the student would land the airplane, do after a full circuit in the pattern, land the airplane, come to a complete stop on the runway, taxi back on the taxiways, time to reflect, time to absorb what just happened, time to prepare for the next circuit, take the runway again, do another circuit around the pattern, land one more time, and so on and so forth as many times as instructed by the instructor. Not only does that afford the student the time to collect themselves, and it's not a fluid event, it's something that can have a pause in there. It also affords the student the ability to check some boxes on the requirements for getting their license with tower work. So kind of a multi-tiered approach to the first solo. Going to the crash itself, and I apologize just for the ease of use here. I think it'll be up on the screen, but I'm watching the ADSB as I'm discussing this with y'all. So it appears that the student was doing a circuit or a pattern on a 28 right, which is a longer runway there at Montgomery Gibbs. And if we look at the pattern being flown, it's a little bit of an unusual pattern. However, we don't, at a controlled environment, there is certainly the aspect that the pattern could be manipulated by the control tower. Maybe they've requested an extended downwind. Maybe they've requested that the student slide away from the runway a little bit, allow for traffic coming in. All that could have been a factor here, but listening to ATC, it doesn't appear so. So it seems as though the pattern was flown a little bit elongated on the downwind, going to a separation from running parallel with 28 right. Perhaps a loss of situational awareness, looking for the runway coming back in. Meanwhile, we have at least 3 airplanes on the ground. Air traffic control is clearing people to depart, it looks like, and work in a steady flow of traffic. As 700 Yankee Zulu comes around, it's referred to by ATC as 0 Yankee Zulu. He's coming around for the base towards a final with a pretty extended base to final, and he says what we believe to be something to the effect of, "My trim is activating by itself."
My trim is activating by itself.
He turns towards the field, and then at that point in time, he calls an emergency.
I have an emergency outside trip, Green 906 Echo, right downwind departure.
And this is while ATC is again clearing airplanes to depart. He announces, I have an emergency over the radio. He is pretty scrambled, and that's a good indication that we're not getting a full transmission on his push-to-talk, which is going to be on that side stick for the SR-20. We're not getting a full transmission, so perhaps he's fighting the trim, fighting the actual control stick itself, or we have that fight or flight where his body's really adrenalined up, and he may not be getting a firm connection on that push-to-talk. But whatever it is, we're not getting a firm communication to ATC, to the point where ATC actually says, whoever has a stuck mic, you have a problem.
Just having a trim problem, you have a stuck mic on 125.7. Just 96 Echo runway 2 right, clear for takeoff.
More of a problem of not a trim problem, but more of a problem of you have a stuck mic, please fix it. Next thing, we have the tower asking 0 Yankee Zulu to go around, recognizing the problem and potentially a move by ATC to alleviate that problem.
0 Yankee Zulu go around, offset north side. 0 Yankee Zulu go around.
And we have tower then instructing 0 Yankee Zulu to offset to the right for the go-around.
0 Yankee Zulu offset to the right.
Typically the offset is done when there's traffic on the runway already and there's a conflict. So rather than have two airplanes, one taking off climbing, one straight ahead climbing on the go-around intercepting here, the air traffic controller has requested the 0 Yankee Zulu sidestep to the side, and then most likely tower would then have them turn an early crosswind and then join the downwind. At the request for the sidestep, 0 Yankee Zulu, the pilot says, I can't, and something to the effect of, I have to land, or I gotta land.
I can't, I gotta land.
2403, so there's 906 Echo, turn out. 906 Echo, use caution, aircraft on field, aircraft on. Aircraft Montgomery Field is closed. Montgomery Field is closed. Montgomery Field is closed. Just a 4-step, help them make a right turn out, divert to Gillespie.
And at that point in time, that's the last communication that we have from 0 Yankee Zulu with the tower. For reference, the aircraft crashed on the field. The pilot was removed, still alive, from the airplane, transported to a hospital, and then later succumbed to his wounds and passed away. Now, obviously, when we look at this wreck, we're going to focus on the fact that the pilot has overtly said there was something wrong with his trim, and to the effect of, my trim is acting automatically or acting on its own. Again, it's a little hard to hear exactly what he's saying, but something where the trim is providing some force that was unanticipated. The first thought with this airplane, with the GFC 700, is perhaps he activated the autopilot, right? The go around the toga button is right here on the throttle, so there's perhaps he had a flight plan in, maybe he hit the go around button, it advanced the GPS, it put the bars up for the flight director into, I believe it's been a while since I've been in a Cirrus, but maybe 7 or 10 degrees there for the nose high attitude there, and advancing the autopilot, or excuse me, advancing the flight plan. But in that circumstance, he still would have had to activate the autopilot. And the GFC 700 panel is right in front of the throttle quadrant, just underneath the screens there. If you follow the entire throttle quadrant, that center console forward, that's where you see that autopilot. It's unlikely with one hand as he's making the base to final turn, and realistically looking at the track, he is on final at the time that he's declaring an emergency. So he would have one hand up here on the side stick, one hand on the throttle. Even if he inadvertently hit the go around button and put those bars up at his takeoff angle, There's really no way to advance or activate an autopilot feature at that point. And surely I would imagine doing stop and goes that he did not have a full flight plan programmed into the Garmin. So realistically, there wouldn't be anything to advance. If he were to inadvertently touch the autopilot and activate it, he'd be moving forward. So potentially he activated the go-around bar, then activated the autopilot, but it just seems unrealistic on final. So that leaves us with really two areas that we can focus. One is going to be a runaway trim, and the other one is going to be if the airplane had what's known as Garmin's envelope speed protection, if it had that feature and if he was high enough for that feature to come into effect. Before we get into the trim runaway, let's talk about the envelope speed protection. What that's designed to do is it has a max speed protection and a min speed protection. In this case, we're critical of the min speed protection. So there are indications from the ADS-B on board the airplane that he was potentially getting a little slow on his base to final, though that's unclear, and that would be really firmed up by that the actual ATC pings coming off of his transponder and ADS-B if somebody were to order those within the 90 days. There is indications, however, based on all the public available and government available ADS-B signatures that he is getting a little slow. If he gets below the low speed envelope or min speed, he'll get an indication, a little CAS message that'll pop up on the PFD, and the airplane will actually pitch itself down to try and maintain a deck angle that'll support a sustainable speed. Surely in that case, with the deck angle going down, there's that is a force that's unintended, right? And that would result, you would think on a student, that would result immediately in the thought of, wait, why is this airplane pitching down? Which would result in the student pulling up. And pulling up, of course, when your min speed is only exacerbating that situation and you're becoming slower and slower. The other aspect that we could explore is the runaway trim. The runaway trim in this case is canceled by reaching up on the first things first is maintaining control of the airplane. The Cirrus SR20 is not hard to override. Sure, a little tough, little resistance, but it's not anything like like a Learjet. If you have a runaway trim where you're essentially grabbing onto the yoke or you're pushing the yoke like this, right? It is manageable with that side stick. And the first thing there would be autopilot off if the autopilot is on. Or while you're maintaining control of the airplane, you could hit the circuit breakers for your pitch trim, your roll trim, and then your autopilot trim if there is an inadvertent autopilot activation, and if the cancellation did not work. Hard to say which one of those it was. Like I said, there is indication at this time that he may have been slow, and in that case, we would have had the envelope speed protection kick on potentially. The thought then is, how high are we? There's a threshold of altitude where that is inhibited so that we don't have an inadvertent activation of it and it puts you in a situation that is uncontrollable close to the ground. We're not going to know the exact altitude until we have the actual ATC tapes. But we can certainly go off of the ADS-B here and suggest that he was likely high enough that the inhibit was not activated, and in fact, envelope speed protection could have been available had he gotten to a slow enough speed. The airplane again would have pitched the deck angle down to try and maintain a manageable or controllable speed. And again, he would have been resisting that, and we would have had that perpetual tug of war resulting in impact with terrain. Or again, the trim. That takes us, the trim runaway, that takes us into the investigation itself. Traditionally, when we're dealing with accidents, we have the involvement of two governmental agencies, as well as local law enforcement is typically there, but the two governmental agencies that we deal with are the NTSB and the FAA. Now, the NTSB is, at the moment, very overworked and very undermanned, as is the FAA, but the NTSB particularly so. So when we have crashes or accidents that don't involve a fatality, that may be just what we call bend in metal, right? You just damage an airplane. In those cases, the congressional power that is assigned to the NTSB to investigate these accidents, the NTSB can actually assign the FAA that power to conduct the investigation and then just report back to the NTSB, and then the NTSB will make a report based on the FAA's findings. In the case of a fatality, though, like this one, it is very likely that NTSB was on the scene, and I believe they were. In that case, FAA will also be on scene, and they're tasked not only with helping the NTSB at the instruction of the NTSB, but the FAA will also run an independent check on independent investigation as well. Traditionally, on crash inspections, the NTSB is looking for something that would impact the fleet, right? Something that would impact all airplanes equipped with a G1000 Perspective NXI, all airplanes equipped with a GFC 700 autopilot, all Cirrus frames, all Generation 6 frames, all 20 frames. There's a lot of different categories that they're looking for, something that could be systemic, something that needs reaction over the entire fleet to have an impact on aviation safety. As opposed to the FAA, when they're not assisting the NTSB, their investigation is primarily focused on regulations and the pilot. Was the student sign-off appropriate for the solo? Was there adequate training for the solo sign-off? Was the pilot, did the pilot have a medical? Certain circumstances like that is what the FAA is going to be focusing on. Now, because they're running two independent paths, they're going to have two different reports. The FAA is going to have their investigative report, which is just a combination of everything that they've done, notes, interviews, weather reports, all that, into their report. And the NTSB is going to be the same. However, the NTSB is going to break it up over time. The NTSB is going to come out with their preliminary report, and that should be coming out really any day now, if not out already at the time of this video. And the prelim is going to be purely a factual report. These are the facts that we know as of right now. It's not going to draw any conclusions, opinions, or findings. It's just going to be more of a factual statement. Then they're going to go into the factual themselves. The factual report is, again, a summary of the facts surrounding the crash. And then from there, we get the final. And the final report, in this case, will most likely come in about 2 years, thereabout, and the findings will have opinions, theories, all the stuff that you would associate with a crash inspection. Also, present on the scene, more than likely, Garmin sent out somebody who was on site that could aid the NTSB and the FAA in their investigation. As they have questions when they're looking at the wreck, they could turn to those representatives and say, hey, talk to me about this. Or, in cases where the wreck is so scattered over a large area, there may be times when the NTSB or the FAA collects an item and says to the representative, what is this? And what other components go with this system that we should be looking for? So Garmin was likely there. Cirrus is most certainly going to be there, again, guiding and helping the NTSB and the FAA with anything that they may have, manufacturer-specific, airframe-specific, model-specific, any questions that they may have. You have a Cirrus representative right there that's able to answer some of those questions. I would suspect those are the only two entities that are there. Potentially, we could have a Lycoming representative there, though I'm not entirely sure. In this case, they might defer because we don't see evidence in the path, at least in the ADSB footage here. We don't see any indication that we have any sort of engine problem. The witness reports certainly state that the airplane seemed to be operating functionally, but it did have some pitch and roll indications as it was working its way towards impacting terrain. So likely there wasn't any engine involvement in this wreck, and it is going to be purely focused on both Cirrus and Garmin on the scene. The airplane will be, once documented and collected and sufficiently investigated on the scene, the airplane will be removed to a salvage yard. At the salvage yard, it will remain under the control of the NTSB. And they will conduct a further inspection that is in a confined area, a little bit more, without the public and without the press and without the environmental factors. Sometimes we get rain or wind when we're out there, so they'll be able to do it in a controlled environment. And again, at that inspection, we're going to have the NTSB, the FAA, likely we're going to have a Cirrus representative, likely we're going to have a Garmin representative, and anyone else at the NTSB or the FAA seems to believe would be beneficial for their investigation. Of course, the purpose of that investigation is purely for the FAA and the NTSB. At that time, we haven't introduced third-party litigants or anything like that, should the crash warrant that down the road. So at some point in time, the NTSB will release the wreck, releasing it likely to the insurance company at that point, and then parties will confer with the insurance company, and then we'll go down the normal path of litigation if that is the path that is viable or desired in this case. The NTSB always has the ability to withhold parts. You know, they could release the majority of the wreck, and in this case, there's a chance that they might withhold or retain rather the pitch servo, the roll servo. Perhaps they retain the actual GFC 700 autopilot face itself. They could retain all that. They could potentially take the cards out of the Garmin, and there's some components, some electrical components there, some non-destructible memory components that perhaps they might retain for a period as they test it. Eventually those components, as long as they're non-destructed, those components will go back to whoever has possession of the aircraft and will be open for investigation at that point by third parties. So that sums up this wreck in kind of a nutshell and a little information through the fire hose. So as the days progress here, and as the NTSB puts out some reports, and as the FAA's reports become available through Freedom of Information Act, and the ATC tapes become available through Freedom of Information Act, we'll learn more on this wreck. But it certainly appears that this was a tragic wreck, as they all are, but certainly tragic in the fact that we have a student solo, and then we have some sort of failure, whether it was pilot-induced or actual equipment-induced, or a combination thereof. We definitely have something worth investigating here, which I'm sure will be the focus in the next coming days and weeks, months, and even years. So thank you very much for joining us on this talk of 700 Yankee Zulu. Appreciate all of you out there, and any comments, concerns, questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Aviation Division of Ramos Law. Thank you very much for your time.